Hello and welcome to today's webinar by Actual Tech Media. The topic is Upleveling Financial Services Defenses, How to Protect a Hybrid Cloud Environment in 2023 and Beyond. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today. This event is presented in partnership with our friends at Rubrik and Microsoft. And we've got a great live discussion lined up for you today on the event. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about today's webinar. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the moderator for the event. As always, we want these to be educational, so we encourage your questions there in the questions pane of the audience console. We'll be taking your questions live. Experts from Rubrik and Microsoft are here to answer your questions. So this is a great opportunity to learn from the leading experts in the field today. Get all your questions answered. We also have some excellent resources there in the handouts tab. I want to call your attention to those resources. Make sure that you check those out and download those before the event wraps up. They won't be as easily accessible right now as after the event as they are right now. And then at the end of the live event today, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing has already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab. And then we also have our best question prize for an additional gift card. Make sure you get your question in. And of course, you need to meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions as well for that. We will be contacting the prize winners after the event. All right. So with that housekeeping information out of the way, it's now time to kick off today's webinar with our expert presenters. I'm excited now to introduce you to two expert presenters. Welcome first to Mr. John Murphy. He is the Global Field Chief Security Officer and CISO at Rubrik. Welcome, John. And
good to be here. Thank you, David.
Absolutely. Great to have you. And then also welcome to Mr. Dan Minicucci, who is the Chief Security Advisor for Financial Services at Microsoft. Dan, it's great to have you on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, first question, let's just kick this off. This is going to be a Q&A, very conversational format here. This one here is really for you, John. I know, Rubrik is making some major new announcements, working heavily with Microsoft as well. And the first thing we want to talk about here is the Rubrik Security Cloud. And this is something that's relatively new to me. It might be relatively new to a lot of the folks in the audience. So can you first start off by just telling us a little bit about what is the Rubrik Security Cloud and how can it help IT organizations, especially in the financial services industry?
Absolutely. Rubrik Security Cloud is Rubrik's latest product offering. It's an evolution of our history as a backup company that's evolved into a data security company, one of the premier data security companies in the industry. And what it provides basically for clients is the ability for you to protect your data at all times, to then understand what's happening with your data and understand what kind of data you have. So from a sensitive data discovery perspective or from a monitoring perspective in terms of things that indicate that there might be some kind of malicious activity happening against your data, like ransomware. And then lastly, we provide you with the capability to quickly recover your entire application suite in an automated way that gives you the ability to meet or exceed your SLAs with customers. A lot of this is built on zero trust principles that we have designed in through Rubrik beginning 8 years ago, believe it or not. Long before zero trust was a concept in the market space, we built a lot of those same minimal rights type principles into the product, and our customers are benefiting from that greatly. We have customers across all industries, and they are all at this point Rubrik Security Cloud customers. Able to take advantage of our security offerings on-prem as well as in the cloud or hybrid. And I'm thrilled to be here with Microsoft. We are a Microsoft partner, one of their busiest partners in the world, actually. Microsoft actually loves our technology and has taken an ownership stake in us previously. And we are a go-to solution for protection of Azure and M365 workloads.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Thank you for that overview of Rubrik Security Cloud. Financial organizations are prime targets out there for malicious attacks and data exfiltration. And this is something that it sounds like could be hugely beneficial, especially in the finance industry. So Let's now move on to our first question here, and that is, what are some of the things that you're tracking from a cyber risk perspective? And again, these are questions we're going to go through that we've polled our audience, we've taken from you out there from past events. These are some of the top questions and concerns in the financial industry. So, John, Dan, you want to start off with that?
I can jump in. The conversations that I have with our financial services customers, there's definitely some key themes that come up. It wasn't, though, until I heard our CISO, Brett Arsenault, say this, that it sort of clicked for me that although these common things are coming up, with our financial services customers, they also seem to resonate with all the others. And the way he described it was this past year was all about 4 R's and an S. Remote work, ransomware, Russia, regulation, and supply chain risk. And I think, in all the conversations that I'm having, those are the things that customers are bringing up. What can we do to help mitigate and reduce our risk to these emerging threats?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add in, I think absolutely, I love that. Brad is on spot as usual. We think of it in terms of, a number of things. So certainly from a ransomware perspective, which is probably the most known threat at this point, the most notorious threat at this point for most organizations and their data. It is top of mind, I think, for everyone from the C-suite on down through all of the technology organization and right on through to regulators, auditors, et cetera. And the question really comes down to, how do we protect our information from attacks that are meant to either put us out of business totally or exploit in some way, shape, or form, perhaps in multiple ways, the value of that data. I think that there's a lot of innovation occurring, unfortunately, with ransomware attackers, and they're figuring out how to leverage their skills as a community against us. And I think that is ultimately the challenge that we all face, more so than just about any other at this point. I think it's really an existential threat for most organizations that get hit.
Yeah, great points. I love that 4 R's and an S. And you make a great point as well, John, that the attackers are getting smarter and smarter. They're spending their days and nights innovating and finding more innovative ways to attack us. So we need to be doing the same and staying one step ahead of them. Next question here. What's the problem with ransomware and how is it evolving?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one if you don't mind, Dan. I think it's some of the things that we talked about in the previous question: double, triple threat ransomware, ransomware as a service. These are all, if you look at them from a market perspective, if these organizations were legitimate organizations, they would be, we would classify these as, clear innovations in terms of how they operate. They're doing things like they're breaking things down into specialized teams. They're outsourcing certain functions. They are taking an approach to it that says we want to have as much automation in our attack processes as possible. And they're looking to execute as quickly as they can. And I think that the challenge with that, when you're dealing with, let's say, ransomware gangs, is simply that those gangs now benefit from whatever the other gangs are doing as well. And more, we're seeing that they do collaborate a lot. I think that the second problem, and this is probably the scarier problem for most organizations, is nation state involvement. I think one of the big challenges that we have, we heard Russia from Brad's view of what was one of the key themes last year. I think Russia, certainly Iran, North Korea, these are countries that we know continue to proliferate and support either directly or through their military organizations the creation of new zero-day threats, of new attack vectors that they'll use against victims. And I think, certainly in the case of Russia, we see some pretty clear evidence of collaboration between the ransomware gangs and the Russian government directly. And that means that the money is probably flowing between those parties in every one of those instances, which makes it very difficult for us to combat just because of the size and breadth of the resources that they have available.
Yeah, those are great points. And, from my perspective, ransomware really has evolved quite a bit. It's really made the cybercrime a tremendously profitable business. I think that the expectations are by 2025, this will be a $10 trillion cost to the world economy. And, we've gone from this world where ransomware was this opportunistic piece of malware that, maybe got run on a device with the hopes that it was something that you cared about recovering. But the reality now, as John mentioned, is you have teams attacking particular organizations and using ransomware as part of their toolkit to drive financial gain for their attack. And they're looking for ways to ensure that the organization pays that ransom. And so some of the evolution of tactics are not just deploying ransomware to encrypt end systems, but doing reconnaissance to understand how do backups occur. Is there a possibility that we can disrupt the backups because of, you have a product like Rubrik and you have that walled off where you can recover your data? That organization is going to be less likely to pay that ransom. But that double, triple extortion comes in other forms too, where we see them, stealing sensitive data from a company and offering that as a proof of life and say, hey, if you don't pay to get your data back, we're going to take this sensitive data that we stole from your organization and monetize it if we can. And if not, we're just going to leak it to put you at risk for financial and reputational risk. And the nation states, it's a whole other ballgame there, right? You have much more sophistication, many more resources available to them. And sometimes they're doing it for financial gain. Sometimes they're doing it just for misdirection. We've saw, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict where Russia was using wiper-style attacks, making it look like it was a ransomware attack. But there's no one on the other side to actually pay a ransom to or decrypt the data. They're just doing it for destructive purposes. And, really, it doesn't matter who you're trying to defend against and what that scenario is. In either case, we encourage customers not to pay that ransom because it adds fuel to the work that's being done there. But it's all around having planning in place for helping to disrupt the attack in the first place. But even more importantly, making sure that you have the resilience practices in place to bring your data back.
Yeah. If I could add one thing, sorry, Dave. I think the other piece that we talk about here, because it sounds like we may be outgunned, certainly when we talk about nation state, but there are things we can do to control this. And I think one of the things that in my own experience I have seen is making sure that, within an organization where you see sensitive data, where you know that an application, let's say, processes PII of some kind or HCI, making sure that you're doing everything you can within your own development process to hide that data, to secure it properly. Field level encryption certainly does take development cycles, no doubt about it. And maybe that gets prioritized lower in the list of development tasks that an organization might be doing. But I think if you look at it through the lens of what if this information got out, and if we can see it inside the environment, and if it gets exfiltrated, somebody else can see it. As Dan said, proof of life is probably the best example of that. I think, we can start to do more to lock down our exposure so that even if the data is exfiltrated, hopefully it's not something that can be decrypted easily because the organization would still be holding the keys.
Yeah, excellent points. Dan, you really blew my mind there when you talked about how the ransomware organizations are doing reconnaissance on these companies to try to find the weakest targets, the ones that have the weakest data protection backup solutions, that have the least chance of restoring their data. And those are the ones they're going to target and skip by, kind of like the house that has the strong security system. The burglar will skip by that house. So great points all around. Let's move on now to our next question here. And, there's a lot of industry experts out there that are recommending organizations take an assume breach approach to their cyber defenses. So what does that mean to you, and why is that important? John?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important for organizations only because it gives them the ability to, lots of times when we look at our defenses, we may want to say, well, the reason that we're doing this, the reason that we're not doing more than we currently are, Maybe it's budgetary, maybe it's ownership, maybe it's things inside the organization. I think if you assume breach, then what you're really saying is, however we get there, let's assume the worst possible case. And then let's plan around that. So let's design our scenarios for, let's say, our business continuity tests with the idea that the worst possible thing that could happen to us happens. That allows us to overcome and sort of be objective about the things that we want to protect in the organization and to actually help to identify those earlier in the process. I think without an assumed breach mentality, there's going to be a natural reticence to question whether or not your defenses are good enough. And I think just assume breach in my mind translates to, well, it's great that we have defense in depth. There's no question about it. We need to continue to do that forever. But let's assume for the moment that that defense in depth is imperfect in some way and will likely be compromised by somebody. What do we do then?
Yeah, and I completely agree with having this assumed breach mindset is important. We see it as, one of the core principles of a zero trust architecture. This reality that you're not going to prevent every breach. And you just need to embrace the reality that a user is going to click on a phishing link, or they're going to accidentally acknowledge an MFA prompt that they shouldn't, or you run a software product that's a victim of a software supply chain attack. And understand, and if you sort of think about it that way, that, hey, these products aren't going to be 100% effective at preventing these control failures. But what happens once that happens? How do we limit the blast radius of any one of those control failures? How do we detect it, and how do we rapidly remediate it? Is a much healthier approach to look at risk within the organization, because, again, none of those controls are going to be perfect, and assumed breach is all around what do we do to limit the damage when we have one of those individual control failures.
Yeah, very smart. I like that. I mean, I think so many organizations out there probably have the, hope this never happens type approach. And this is a whole different mindset here. Just assume that we're going to get breached and be prepared for it. So very smart, very smart. Let's see. Next question here. How can practitioners prepare their organization to be resilient in the face of constant cyber attack innovations?
I can start with this one if you want, John. This is a really good one. The resilience, part of it is, what can we do on the detection and prevention side? What are the best practices that we should adopt? Talk to vendors like Microsoft, get guidance from organizations like CISA and others around, what are attackers doing, and how can you look to disrupt those attacks? But the other side of it is, what do you do if that attack is successful, that assumed breach mentality? And it's important for organizations to think about it really in the worst case scenario. Like, it's great that you've done all this effort around, security controls, but what if that attack was completely successful? How do you recover? And the important part of that for the organizations is to plan and build muscle memory around that recovery. Who in the organization needs to take action? Who's going to make the call on what systems to take down or up in light of this attack? And one of the things that we recommend for customers is to conduct regular tabletop exercises as a way to build that muscle memory, and to think about what it would take to bring the organization back from a successful attack, regardless of how successful it was. One of the things that our DART team runs into a lot with customers, and they're our customer-facing incident response team. They're flying all around the world, parachuting in to help customers kick adversaries out of their environment. With ransomware attacks, imagine a world where you have no Active Directory. Maybe you have no DNS. Maybe your backup environment was a target of that ransomware attack. Now what? Lots of organizations are good at showing RPO and RTO around an individual workload. But have you practiced that forest level recovery? Have you thought about what it takes to bring up your core infrastructure before you can start layering on your applications in the rest of the environment? Becomes some of the important facets of those tabletop exercises.
Dan, there's so much goodness there. I mean, You hit on so many great points. I think I just add two. I think part of the problem with organizations over time is that they tend to accrete applications. They tend to, not take a service from outside, but build a solution themselves. Maybe it's end user development. Maybe it's it's stealth IT kind of things over time. And what happens when a breach occurs, or when there's some kind of urgency, even if it's in the breach, organizations are sort of left struggling with, okay, how do I recreate application X? We have a CMDB. We use the CMDB to quickly go back and say, okay, application X consists of the following things. It's got VMs, it's got storage, it's got all those things that we need. Great. We pull that back together, and we find that some of that end user developed technology maybe that never found its way to the CMDB, and now the application doesn't work because of it. And you're finding this out at the worst possible time because you're trying to recover. You're trying to overcome, let's say, an adversary from outside, or maybe an operational loss. But the challenge really becomes understanding what you need to do to get that application up and running. And the answer, I think, is we have to look at business continuity management, disaster recovery, as a fully funded, ongoing, non-side of desk type job that we need to commit to. Because I think the challenge that a lot of us face, and speaking from years of experience on the industry side, is we do tend to view those things as sometimes a checkbox exercise. Can we recover? Yes or no? Yes. We, under extremely perfect conditions, we can recover the data that we're trying to recover for this particular application or this particular test. And I think that's well and good, but muscle memory, as Dan mentioned, is the key to dealing with the stuff that you don't realize until it's too late. So if you're really, really great at keeping to your RPO and RTO, and you're really, really practiced at exercising the recovery scenario, then when those bumps happen, and they will, you're much more likely to be able to adopt quickly and to make sure that you can get things back up and running. There's a great Mike Tyson quote that I absolutely love, which is everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. And, that failure, whether it's operational or cyber, is the punch in the face that we all need to anticipate so that we have the ability to quickly get things back up and running. And I think that also leads to, Dan, you made a second point, and I think it was about tabletop exercises. And tabletop exercises, I couldn't agree more. Those are so key. Part of what we do with Rubrik, part of the services that we provide, are something called the rapid response team, or ransomware response team. And that team is dedicated to working with any client who calls us. From the moment that they detect something's wrong with the data that they're backing up using Rubrik until the moment that they tell us, okay, we're good, go away, we're with them, and we're giving them best practices on how to recover. And one of those tools, obviously, is a ransomware recovery tool set. Now, we have the ability to share that with customers so that they can see that in advance. Another great point, Dan, you made was Active Directory. What we see oftentimes is that Active Directory is looked at as the same backup data that the rest of the production environment is in. And therefore, when somebody penetrates the environment and poisons Active Directory, everything suffers. And so some of the best practices that we often talk about are keeping a different backup of Active Directory in a completely off-net store. And having the ability to use that in the event that something like this happens, so that you're not, forced to go to Gmail or private email addresses while you try to get key systems back up and running.
Such excellent points. I love the idea of developing muscle memory around recovery. I mean, I know IT organizations out there, they've deployed 1,000 servers, they've deployed 1,000 applications, but have they, tested recovery 1,000 times? And the answer is probably not. So I'm picturing like a professional athlete, practicing their golf swing 1,000 times. We need to be as practiced with muscle memory, for recovery, just as much as we are with other things in IT. So very well said. Let's move on and talk about a little bit about cyber insurance here. Cyber insurance premiums have been doubling year over year, while fewer insurers are offering coverage. Why do you think that is?
Dan, I'll jump into this one if you'd like.
Go for it.
I think if you look at insurance models in general, they're based on statistical observations, right? So life insurance is based upon the likelihood that I'll achieve a certain age, and that I'll have some medical conditions along the way, and we can predict what those are because we've got tons and tons of data that the industry's built up over many years of offering insurance. I think the challenge that we have with cyber insurance is there's just not enough data. I think organizations, insurance organizations rushed in to offer cyber coverage, and I think quickly realized that there's not a single standard you can use to say, you fit into this category, and we have a ton of data that says this category will be hit or will not be hit, and here's the likelihood, and here's the outcome that we can predict. So without that, I think the challenge that unfortunately insurers are finding is that a lot of those policies were paying out, and they were paying out in far greater number than they were actually making in terms of premium. So we see the natural reaction, which is they need to cover their losses. They're risk managers like the rest of us. So they're increasing premiums year on year, or in some cases, they're deciding not to offer cyber insurance until they have enough maturity, until they see enough groundwork in terms of being able to objectively evaluate the cyber health of an organization to make risk-based decisions on whether or not they'll offer that organization some level of cyber insurance. And I think that is probably going to go away. I think it's just going to take a little bit of time until they get to the point where they can understand just what risk is and how to properly categorize it. We are at Rubrik working with some insurance vendors and brokers to try to develop that level of understanding of the cyber hygiene, the cyber health of an organization. And I'm pretty confident we'll get there, and we'll have a basis that they can use to objectively measure. But again, I think that's going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah, this cyber insurance topic is a great one. I think that we could probably go back and forth with a lot of points about what's happening with cyber insurance, but I totally agree with your points. Cyber insurance has been around longer than a lot of people realize. 2.5 decades. People were selling cyber insurance around Y2K and the loss of PII and these other things. But fast forward to 2019. When ransomware became as popular as it is, it really changed the game a lot. And so while, that those previous 2 decades, cyber insurance was highly profitable for a lot of insurers, they're finding it's not so much anymore because they don't have the data to build the models around, what is the impact of one of these ransomware attacks? And how do you even quantify it? Because it's, if a company is taken out of offline as a result of one of these attacks, and it has impacts to downstream customers who may file lawsuits later, what is the ultimate cost of that attack? And that's what a lot of the insurers are struggling with, and it's driving the outcomes that are mentioned here. Premiums are going up. There's cases where they're not continuing to offer that insurance. I guess I'll say I agree with all of it. It's interesting to see how it's unfolding, and it's interesting to see where it'll head to.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the we leverage in the industry and pretty much across any industry. When you're talking about cyber, there are some key frameworks that we all leverage. Right? It's NIST, it's ISO 27001. It's FedRAMP if you're in the government space. All of these things give us a sense of order in terms of how we do things, in terms of how we protect our organizations. But the challenge is that they're not necessarily objective. Right? You can't look at an organization and say, you have a score of 27 when it comes to NIST, and the perfect score is 30, let's say. So without that, and until we have something along those lines, I think the challenge is always going to be, when do you want to wade back into the risk pool? And at what point do you think you have enough data to make those decisions? In the meantime, I think organizations ought to look at that and say, okay, in the absence of some underwriting of risk from an external insurance company, what do I need to do to better secure the environment so that I can avoid the risk to begin with? and hopefully make myself a better risk candidate at some point in the future when that organization does have the ability to get cyber insurance.
Yeah, excellent points. I mean, organizations need to improve their defenses and recovery capabilities because it's getting tougher and tougher to get cyber insurance. Excellent. All right. Moving on. Another question here. What are some strategies for working with regulators and living with the systematic risk? John?
Yeah, so this is a great question, but it's probably a question with no single answer.
Yeah.
I think first and foremost, what we see is that regulators are now very, very interested in understanding what kind of risk we have from a cyber perspective and quantifying it. So they've always been interested in cyber risk, but I think the real challenge that's come from things like ransomware and certainly other big outages is as we become more and more cloud centric and more comfortable with taking services from outside our own organization, that increases risk. Now, the risk to, let's say, company A and company B who are, doing business with each other across town may not be significant. But when you combine company A and B with the rest of the alphabet, suddenly you start to look at that in terms of what's going to happen should we have enough of the companies start to experience problems. Will the whole system collapse? Will we be able to work together in any way, shape, or form? And probably the best example of that I can think of are payment systems, let's say like SWIFT or FedWire or anything that we would use to fund sort of the global investments and global payments. And I think regulators now are seeing that and saying, okay, well, that's where we really need to understand how we can better prevent risk from creeping into the environment and better manage it and understand it as we sort of mature. So I kind of view this as some basic things. Number one, it's if you're an organization, understand what your critical applications are. What are those party applications that you have? And understand how they contribute, let's say, to overall systemic risk. So if you're a payments provider, if you provide a lot of PCI type services to the industry, what happens to the industry if your key applications go down? I think, number one, having that inventory and then having that very clear understanding of how to recover those applications and those capabilities is the first step. And I think being transparent to regulators as much as you can be in terms of the strengths and maybe the opportunities for improvement in your program is also key. It sort of goes back to that point about assuming breach. Let's just assume for the moment that we're imperfect. And let's be open and honest with what those imperfections are, because that's going to help us to drive the changes that we need to within the organization to make them less risky. And I think finally, in my mind, I mentioned CMDBs before, and CMDBs are part and parcel of understanding what those key applications are. What are those applications or those things that you're known for in the industry, and having the ability to readily enumerate what those are and recover is ultimately, I think, what regulators are first and foremost concerned with.
That's all well. Sorry, I think that's well said, John. And I am observing some of the impacts of that to the banking customers that I talk to, where the regulators are sort of challenging those banks to say, what's a minimally viable bank? Can you build this set of critical applications and their dependencies in a way that you can wall them off from other types of attacks or incidents inside of your environment to help address sort of that systematic risk and the importance of the financial services industry as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Yeah, great advice. All right, let's move on to our next question. There's been a number of new or proposed requirements for disclosing cyber incidents. What's top of mind for you, and what's really driving these new regulations? Dan?
Yeah, so I think transparency, the expectation from the public to understand, how their data is impacted by breaches, how this impacts the financials of a corporation are driving some of this. The SEC's proposal that came out in spring is one that I've been keeping an eye on, where I think that they are trying to mandate that organizations disclose any incidents within 4 days of them being discovered inside of the environment. And, I think that there's a lot of positive points around that. I think that there's also some trade-offs. There's cases where when we identify an adversary in the environment, we are looking to understand the full impact before we show our hand. And sometimes that can take longer than 4 days to discover all that. And so what we have to think about, as some of these regulations materialize, is how that may sort of be to our detriment and maybe to the attacker's advantage.
And John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to, again, great points. I think the driver in my mind is transparency. What they're really looking to do is to now expose some of the things that, quite honestly, as practitioners, we've been able to deal with internally within organizations. So an outage of a critical application, let's say, might be client impacting, but it might not be. And if it's not something that we had to report before, well, there's some risk there that stakeholders outside the organization may not be aware of. So folks who are investors in the company, board members even, who aren't exposed to that level of disclosure, may now be able to make better decisions, or at least more informed decisions, based upon the fact that they have that awareness. I think the other driver is, and we saw this in 2008 after the financial crisis as well, I think regulators are looking to make sure that boards have a solid understanding of risks. So after 2008, certainly there was a huge focus on making sure that there was good financial understanding presence on boards, right? And that boards were fully aware of what was happening with the organization from a financial perspective, and that shareholders, stakeholders, markets also had that level of transparency. I think this is the evolution of it in some way, shape, or form, where I think regulators are now saying, okay, great, this is potentially systemic risk, but it certainly is risk that may not be transparent to end users. So we want to understand when something happens. To Dan's point, 4 days from an SEC perspective to disclose a material event from the time you recognize it's a material event. They also want to see those disclosures on Form 8K. They want to see them in annual reports potentially. And they also want to understand who on your board has some level of cyber experience. It's not meant to say that somebody has to have cyber experience. They just want to understand who has cyber experience, if anybody does on your board. And I think that's going to drive the next evolution for roles like CISO that move out of the technology only world and into more the business risk world.
Very smart. And I'm curious, I hate to put you on the spot, but I mean, how do you see these increased regulations? Do you see these as an over expansion, or is this really a good thing for organizations to kind of push them to do the right thing?
Dan, you want to go?
I would say overall, I see it as a positive thing. I think that there's just some things that we need to keep an eye on as these regulations expand.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think in technology, we're all used to the pendulum swinging to the extreme, right? So, we're decentralized, then we're centralized, and we're back and forth. I think to some extent, we will see some excess in terms of regulation, but overall, I expect that will work its way through over the course of some number of years, maybe. But eventually, we're better off for it. I think the more transparency we have, even within the organization, let's just say you're not a publicly traded organization, having the ability for the CISO to be that board presence as well as the chief executive for information security is only a good thing for organizations.
Excellent. Let's see, another top question here. What advice do you have around best practices for protecting data as companies move to a more hybrid cloud environments?
Maybe I'll start on that one and then have you fill in what I missed, John. The most important part and the challenge that most organizations struggle with is, where is my sensitive data? You can't protect it unless you know about it. And so it really starts with having the ability to do data discovery, sensitive data discovery, so that you can start to think about how you can control and protect that data. Beyond that, practices around privilege access management. Unfortunately, we see too many organizations that perhaps strove for at least privilege access, but ended up, over provisioning, not doing a good job of keeping administrative credentials off of end user workstations, and attackers, ransomware attackers in particular. I've heard them referred to as technical debt collectors. And so when we have these problems that we know about, we haven't gotten around to fixing, it becomes something that they are very good at exploiting within the organization, and putting the organization on their heels, and results of some of these attacks. And so those are two things that I would cite for this.
Yeah, and I would add, identity is probably the key to successfully deploying into cloud. And what I mean by that is understanding where all the identities that you will use in your cloud environment come from, and having very, very strict and discrete controls on them is probably one of the most basic things that organizations can do to be really, really successful. And the reason I say that is oftentimes there's a need to, let's say, have certain access to certain data, and we tend to over provision. I think part of the challenge with being in the information world for as long as I have is you realize that we build most of our applications for people who are going to use them for the purposes that they were intended to build. And so what that means is I offer the ability for somebody who works in the building system to manipulate building records. The challenge, of course, is what if the person who has access isn't somebody in the billing department and they're not doing their natural job? But that's a mental model that we sort of have to overcome and change. That's going to take time. But building in that idea that we have absolute control over the identities that will be used at any point in time in this new hybrid environment, and making sure that we are managing those to zero trust principles as best we can, I think really positions the organization pretty well to be successful. I think if you look at that on top of that, having the ability to say, look, I know where my backup data is at all points in time, and it is segmented from the rest of my network. And at the point in time that I chose to execute a backup, I know that it's good, and that's my recovery point. I think that's also a critical thing. It's an easy thing to do, especially with tools like Rubrik, of course, but it's something that organizations really ought to be good at. So it's really, if you think about it, in the old world where we had, let's say, 2 data centers, and we were replicating data between them, we were fine as long as both data centers didn't go away at the same time. I think the challenge that we have with attackers being in our environments is that there's a real potential that they can cause exactly that same outcome by poisoning any copy of data that we have. But sort of by pushing this out and leveraging the beauty of cloud to be that third offsite copy or that fourth offsite copy really gives you the ability to overcome a lot of the challenges that they might introduce in order to monetize their access to our environments.
Excellent advice on best practices. I mean, every company out there is moving to some sort of hybrid model. So really great advice. Let's see here. Another good question. IT leaders like to focus on a product. I know I've been guilty of that, looking for the next silver bullet to address security problems. What are some of the industry best tools and techniques for protecting data against cyber threats?
You want to take this one, John?
Yeah, sure. I was wondering which one of us was going to volunteer to go first. So certainly, I think there is absolutely the drive for tool sets, right? And I'm a technologist at heart, have always been. I think there's a need first and foremost to sort of separate the tool from the function and look at it from a functional perspective. Understanding who's in our environments, that identity point that we talked about before is critical. So always understanding who is in, let's say, the hybrid environment is key to understanding just what your risk profile is in that scenario. There are lots of tools that we could use to do that. And I won't go into any specific recommendations, only because I think there are many good alternatives to look at. But monitoring is probably the fundamental thing that we need to do with those. So whatever the tool of choice is for identity management, making sure that that tool feeds into your monitoring processes, and so that your SOC, your SIM, they're actively getting any kind of anomalies that, might indicate we have a problem. The classic example of John Murphy logs in Rome, and 2 minutes later, John Murphy logs in from an IP in China, indicate something that really is a likely significant indicator that there's something wrong in your environment. So certainly that is key. I think the ability to understand where your data is at all points, scanning, and this is where Rubrik can absolutely help, is key as well, because where are the crown jewels? Where's the data that's going to cost you the most if it's exposed, if it's exfiltrated? Understanding that and being able to go after that well before you get to a breach event or an attack event is also key. And so I would recommend, obviously, Rubrik as the solution for protecting that data from the time that it's backed up in an immutable format in an off-net store, through to the monitoring of that and indicators using AI and ML as to things that might be problematic, or at least something that should be investigated, and right on through to automating recovery, so that we have, unfortunately, we want to try to get as much automation in and as little human involvement in as we possibly can, because that's going to drive mean time to recovery down, and also going to give us the ability to recover with full confidence. So I think those are some things that certainly Rubrik offers to any client who is interested in leveraging our tool set and our capabilities. But I think also the fundamental principles behind them are the things that organizations should be looking at first.
I really agree with everything that you said. I think the world has changed, and the digital estate that we're trying to protect has changed. We're hybrid now. We have more advanced adversaries that we're trying to defend against, and we really need fundamental security principles to change for how we are going to keep our data safe. Principles like explicit verification, right? How do we make sure that the user that we're granting access to the data is really who they say they are? It's no longer a world where we can say, hey, the user typed in their password correctly and they have access to the resource, like we did, for the past 2 decades with Active Directory inside of corporate networks, with people working from home, with people using different types of devices, with our sensitive data, living in different services. We need to do more to drive up that assurance. Least privilege is another one of those principles. We talked about assumed breach and why that's important. And a big part of that assumed breach is resilience. What do you do if that attack is completely successful, and making sure that you're planning your resilience capabilities around that. And a product like Rubrik is amazing at helping with that. And so, I guess that's my thoughts on it.
If I could add one more, and this absolutely is a Rubrik capability as well, it's continually scanning for known IOCs. So we have gotten really good at sharing information about known indicators of compromise across almost every industry sector. And so it's fantastic that those sources are out there. Building a capability where you're constantly looking at your environment and you're looking for those known indicators really is the right thing to get going in most organizations, and doing it in an automated way so that we're not people dependent in that process either. Because the minute that you detect an IOC that's known to have happened somewhere else is the minute that the alarm bell should go off. The doors are automatically locked, and we start to do whatever we need to do to make sure the environment is safe. I think that's really a critical step for most organizations as well.
Excellent, wise advice. Thank you so much. Let's see here. Final question. I think we're starting to run out of time on today's event, and that is, if IT organizations, and specifically financial services organizations, want to learn more about the Rubrik and Microsoft solutions that we talked about on the event today, John, you take it first. What do you recommend?
Absolutely. I recommend both looking at diversifying your risk internally by leveraging SaaS services like 365, and certainly leveraging tools like Rubrik. We have a long history of doing fantastic work across multiple industries. Some of the largest financials in the world are Rubrik customers, and they're customers for that reason. I would say reach out to your Rubrik representative, and we'll have that information available to you. And let's have a conversation.
Okay, excellent. Well, this has been really great. I've learned so much on the event today. I mean, so much actionable advice, especially for financial services organizations to better protect themselves, defense in depth, assume breach. So much wisdom here. John, Dan, it's been great having you on the event today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
And for more information, of course, visit Rubrik.com and Microsoft.com, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. And with that, it's now my pleasure to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card prize on today's event. Let's see, this one is going out to Joel McAvoy from Massachusetts. Congratulations. Joel McAvoy from Massachusetts will be reaching out to you to deliver your Amazon gift card prize, and we'll also be reaching out to our best question prize winner as well. Thank you to everyone who submitted all the excellent questions on the event today. Experts from Rubrik and Microsoft will be getting back to you. We always appreciate those, and we want to help you to solve your IT challenges on these events. Thank you to everyone who joined, and have a great day. See you next time. Bye-bye.